Welcome to my YouTube history channel, Utrace.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm absolutely thrilled you're here today. We are embarking on a massive 400-year historical journey in this explainer. We're going to unpack one of the most formidable forces to ever exist on Earth, an entity that quite literally reshaped global borders, economies, and entire cultures. So let's just dive right in and explore the incredibly complex story of the rise, the immense expansion, and the ultimate fall of the British Empire. You've probably heard this old saying before, right? The sun never sets on the British Empire. It's an incredible, almost poetic image. But at its peak, you have to remember this wasn't just a metaphor. It was a literal geographical reality. Because its territories span the globe all the way from India to Africa, Canada to Australia, somewhere in the world, it was always daytime in British-controlled territory. It paints this picture of absolute, almost mythical triumph and unprecedented global scale. But I want us to pause and actually look past that whole mythos for a second. How exactly did a relatively small, rainy island nation become the undisputed center of a global empire? Was it just sheer military brute force? Or was the real secret a highly calculated mix of trade, naval dominance, industrialization, and some incredibly shrewd political strategy? Well, let's break down exactly how this happened. Section 1. From trade to power. Picture this. Before Britain was a global superpower, England was essentially just a maritime kingdom desperately looking for an edge. In the 16th and 17th centuries, they were looking out at a world completely dominated by massive, established powers like the Spanish, the Portuguese, and the unbelievably wealthy Mughal Empire over in the Indian subcontinent. England realized their path to power wasn't going to be over land. It had to be over the oceans. To really understand this, we have to look back to the year 1600, when Queen Elizabeth I granted a charter to the East India Company. Now, this started purely for commerce. They wanted Asian spices, silk, and those heavily sought-after Indian textiles. But guys, this was no ordinary business. Over time, this trading organization evolved to possess its own soldiers, its own forts, and its own weapons. In fact, at one point, this private company had a corporate army twice the size of the actual British military. It literally became a massive political and military force in its own right. And they had a formula for how they expanded. It was sequential and honestly, almost ruthless. First, merchants would establish trading posts. Where that trade grew, military protection was brought in to secure those financial assets. Well, once the military was present, political influence naturally started to grow. And finally, where political influence became strong enough, direct control was enacted. That step-by-step mechanism, that became the defining feature of British imperial expansion. Section 2. The economic engine. Now add the Industrial Revolution to the mix, and you completely supercharge that formula. During the 18th and 19th centuries, the Industrial Revolution totally transformed Britain into the world's leading industrial power. Steam-powered, hungry factories were just turning out textiles, machinery, and ships on an enormous scale. But that created a whole new problem. These factories needed massive amounts of raw materials, and they needed new global markets to actually sell all those mass-produced goods. So colonies rapidly shifted from being mere trading posts to vital, indispensable engines that fed the British economy. They provided the materials, the labor, and crucially, the buyers. Perhaps nowhere is this shift wilder or more dramatic than in India. In 1757, we hit a major turning point, the Battle of Plassey. The East India Company, led by Robert Clive, actually defeated the forces of Bengal's Nawab, Siraj-ud-Dowlah. Think of this as essentially a hostile corporate takeover of an incredibly wealthy nation. It was won through political alliances and exploiting internal divisions. And by taking control of Bengal's vast revenues, the company suddenly gained immense wealth to fund even more military expansion. Trade had officially and irreversibly turned into territorial power. So you end up with this intensely unequal economic dynamic. Indian raw materials, like cotton, were exported directly to Britain. Then, British factories transformed those materials into mass-produced goods, which were immediately flooded right back into Indian markets. This crushed India's traditionally famous textile sector, leading to the rapid decline of highly valued artisanal products like Bengal muslin. It's a dynamic that caused severe economic hardship and shrinking opportunities for so many traditional Indian industries, all while massively enriching Britain. Section 3. Controlling a global network. Which naturally brings up a fascinating logistical question. At its height, Britain influenced hundreds of millions of people. So how does a tiny island actually maintain control over a massive global network with a comparatively small population? Well, the answer starts on the water. The Royal Navy ruled the seas by securing highly specific, vital geographic choke points. These weren't just random dots on a map. They were the absolute gateways to global trade. Gibraltar controlled the Mediterranean, the Cape route secured the southern tip of Africa, Malta was the central Mediterranean base, Singapore locked down Southeast Asian trade, and later the Suez Canal provided a dramatically shorter, strategically vital route directly to India. Basically, control the sea and you control the world. But on land, you need a totally different playbook. They relied heavily on local rulers, local administrators, and the massive British Indian Army, which was largely made up of local soldiers. They also leaned heavily into divide and rule political strategies, exploiting existing divisions to strengthen their own authority. And look at the technology they deployed, railways and telegraphs. These served a brilliant dual purpose. Sure, they modernized local infrastructure, but crucially, they allowed the British to rapidly move troops and coordinate military operations to maintain strict, unyielding imperial control. Section 4. The Price of Empire. Now, an organism this massive simply can't expand forever without some serious pushback. We have to look at the inevitable resistance and the severe human costs that came with this kind of global dominance. Britain learned a very early, very dramatic lesson that their empire was vulnerable. Across the Atlantic, the 13 American colonies increasingly opposed British taxation and political control, famously rallying around the cry, "No taxation without representation." The 1773 Boston Tea Party created the world's most famous and definitely saltiest cup of tea, sparking a conflict that escalated into the Revolutionary War. By 1783, supported by France, the Americans won their independence. It was a massive warning sign. An empire could absolutely lose its territories. And that resistance just kept brewing elsewhere. Fast forward to 1857 in India, soldiers, civilians, and political leaders staged a massive rebellion against the East India Company's rule. While the uprising was eventually suppressed, its consequences were monumental. It effectively ended the East India Company for good. In 1858, the British government was forced to step in and take direct crown control over India. Ironically, while power heavily centralized in the short term, the seeds for future independence movements had firmly been planted. It is also absolutely vital in this explainer that we impartially acknowledge that this era was marked by immense human suffering. The empire reshaped economies for its own interests, often with devastating consequences. A painful example of this is the Bengal famine of 1943, right in the middle of wartime colonial rule. Now, while historians continue to debate the precise causes and the exact responsibility of British policies, there is absolute certainty that this famine caused devastating suffering and millions of deaths. The history of the empire is deeply complex and tied to severe human costs that we can't ignore. Section 5. The Fall and Collapse. As we hit the 20th century, the global landscape shifted dramatically, and that imperial metabolic engine finally began to break down. A series of rapid, crippling global events made the empire just impossible to maintain. The First World War heavily depleted Britain's finances, while colonial soldiers who fought and died for the empire began powerfully questioning why they couldn't govern themselves. In India, Mahatma Gandhi led a mass movement of nonviolent resistance, using tactics like the Salt March to make millions of people impossible to suppress with mere force. Finally, the Second World War utterly exhausted the British economy, leaving the nation heavily indebted, exactly as the US and the Soviet Union emerged as the new dominant global superpowers. All of these pressures culminated in one definitive, earth-shattering turning point, 1947. This is the year that changed the history of the British Empire forever. In 1947, India finally gained its independence, and the partition of British India created India and Pakistan. For Britain, the loss of India wasn't just a loss of a piece of territory on a map. It was the loss of the very core of its imperial economy and global strategy. The great engine was officially broken. Following 47, it was just a total domino effect, rapid and undeniable. After India and Pakistan, Sri Lanka gained independence. Then, nationalist movements across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean challenged colonial rule. Ghana became independent, followed by Nigeria and later Kenya after a very difficult struggle. One after another, systematically, the flags of the European empires came down across the globe. Section 6. A complex, lasting legacy. By the second half of the 20th century, the British Empire as a functioning political entity had largely disappeared, but its influence certainly didn't vanish overnight. When evaluating the empire's legacy today, historians debate two very different perspectives. Supporters often point to the spread of modern infrastructure, the English language, educational and parliamentary institutions, and legal systems that continued to evolve post-independence. Meanwhile, critics emphasize a system of profound exploitation, extracted wealth, political repression, the destruction of local industries, and the forcing of colonial borders that literally still drive today's international news cycle. Both of these realities are crucial parts of the ongoing historical debate. What is absolutely undeniable, though, is that this relatively small island nation changed the world forever. It rose through trade, industrialization, and military might, before slowly collapsing under the immense weight of world wars and the universal human demand for freedom. Which leaves us to reflect on the ultimate historical lesson here. Looking at the monumental rise and the inevitable fall we've just covered together, can any global superpower truly last forever? Power can rise, and power can absolutely dominate, but eventually, the world always changes. I'll leave you to ponder that one. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive. See you next time.
Your support means a lot. See you in the next video.